In Porto Alegre, there was a very interesting process that we could say went in two stages. In the early stage, when the participatory budget was implemented, it was a vehicle for not just improving the inclusion of local citizens in decision-making, but in redistributing public services towards poor neighborhoods. And there are significant studies and data to prove that this redistributive and participatory effect not only affected the way the city was designed, but also how civil society was organized. However, as the years went on and that policy attempted to scale up to larger scale infrastructure, we find that it was much more difficult to implement this inclusive and participatory approach with larger scale infrastructure. And in the 2000s, as major infrastructure came, especially for the World Cup, we find that much of that infrastructure did not have the same kind of transformative effect as the policy was able to implement in the earlier stages at the smaller scale. During this more inclusive phase of the participatory budget, we find that the poorest neighborhoods of the city were the ones who were most benefited, and that over time, as the first neighborhoods got their benefits, other neighborhoods began to mobilize. So there was a process, a cycle, not just of expansion of the benefits of the participatory budget policy, bringing new services and infrastructure to poor neighborhoods, but also mobilization of civil society. Over time, however, as we have mentioned before, this process was not able to be sustained in a continued process of expansion of this redistributive effect. In Porto Alegre, the key urban change agents were, in the 1990s, a group of actors within the Workers' Party, an innovative party that was taking office at the municipal level, that had proposals for creating a more participatory and inclusive type of urban policies, and worked very closely with local social movements and especially community and neighborhood groups. Over time, however, the types of political agents changed, and the relationship with local neighborhood organizations changed. And so that's one of the reasons why this policy lost traction over time. One of the interesting factors that we can see happening in the Porto Alegre case is that as the Worker Party shifted from the local to the national level, and other actors came in to power at the local level, there was a failure to build strong coalitions between these two levels, and there was different types of forces pressuring on the city between the federal and the national level. So in a sense, the lack of coalitions might help explain, and especially the lack of coalitions promoting a more participatory and inclusive approach might help explain one of the reasons why the participatory inclusive approach of the Porto Alegre experiment lost priority in the municipal government. There's an interesting relationship that has to do with how financing of urban infrastructure affected this story in Porto Alegre. In a certain sense, if there hadn't been an increase in municipal funds that allowed there to be more funds available for infrastructure investments autonomously controlled by the local government, the participatory budget experiment would not have been able to develop in the 1990s. So it was clear that it was very important, the existence of financial capabilities that allowed the municipal government to implement this innovative and participatory experiment. However, in the 2000s, what happens is that new sources of funding from the federal level become available in a scale that had not existed in the 1990s. And those sources of funding brought much more money for large-scale infrastructure that did not come connected to requirements that citizen participation occur, or that there be a clear equity-based focus of that infrastructure. So in that sense, the funding brought a less participatory approach. In the same sense, related to how planning was related to the process, it's just interesting to note how the model of the participatory budget was more or less maintained during this whole period between 1990 and 2016. We have pretty much the same formal model of participation being implemented, but the changing political conditions and the changing relationships with funding for major infrastructure completely changed the meaning of how that model was implemented. emptying it out of its more inclusive character that it had in the earlier phase. I think that the Porto Alegre case demonstrates the difficulty we have in scaling up participatory and inclusive projects. Conducting an experiment that involves getting local people involved and deciding how to distribute small-scale infrastructure is politically much more feasible than getting those people involved in large-scale infrastructure where much more powerful interests care about how money is spent and what the decisions are made. So it's a politically easier purpose. The smaller scale project is politically easier to implement. And in a sense, the Porto Alegre experiment was never able to develop an alternative, inclusive participatory technology that could go beyond, effectively go beyond that small scale.